and I chose the socio-ecological model because we're very familiar, and many of us kind of work at this adolescent sort of center of the model outwards. And the sort of the challenge, we're doing that really well. That's where the donor funding is. We're reaching young people in thousands and really having an impact at the sort of the center going out. The sort of the heart of the discussion today, and what's at the center is really kind of pushing ourselves and flipping the paradigm and really looking at, some of the outer layers, and so working within some of those systems, right? So looking at, whether it's education or workforce development or health, and looking at how changing the systems has an impact on young people that more in the millions, and really looks at taking our impact towards that scale and level of sustainability. So just in terms of, I'll Save the Children, and this is kind of like how this learning session has evolved, and what we wanted to share with you as we get started. We're a $2 billion, 170 country children and youth serving movement, right? So we're always trying to push ourselves in terms of how can we reach more children and youth, and the system level of thinking is really kind of pushing us in that direction. And for us, and hopefully, I know this will be a good discussion, there needs to be a starting point, right? And it's much harder to work at the systems level, and it takes a lot more effort and a longer period of time to see the lasting effects. But a good sort of starting point is a foundation, and a framework provides that. And so we've looked at a number of systems level foundations, and chose the one we'll be discussing today because it's multidimensional, it's evidence-based, it's worked for practitioners and for donors. So it's a good start to the conversation. I also wanted to share with you, as I mentioned, we did not want this session to just be a one-off. I think often, systems level work is relegated kind of to, sustainability and scale, and it's an afterthought in some of our work. And I think, there is a group of us that has come together through a youth system collaborative that is trying to ensure that that the work is moving forward, and that we are learning from one another and strengthening sort of the tools, the approaches, the methodology, and moving the work in that direction. So for that, I wanted to give kind of the connection to this collaborative, and I know some of my colleagues are also on the call. And if you're interested about learning about the work of collaborative, we've been able to make some really key strides in terms of influencing both donors and learning from each other as practitioners. Okay, so I don't want to take too much more time, but I do want to introduce John a little bit more, because it really has been a privilege to work with him on and learning more about this inverted triangle of framework. So as Alexandra mentioned earlier, John is the director of a newly created, launched collective Change Lab, and I hope we'll get to discuss that a little bit maybe towards the end. It's a global nonprofit focused on expanding the use of transformational strategies to support social and environmental problem solving. So it's really, really exciting. It's really taking the systems level work, not just for youth. And I think the framework can work not only in the youth sector, it could be applied to other sectors as well. But it's very exciting to see how a lab that's taking systems level work to a whole new level. And I know I've been following sort of John's work at the FSG Institute, and he really dedicated a majority of his career to accelerating social impact and system change, and he speaks and writes about it extensively and has worked with diverse set of stakeholders, again, both donors and So, with that, I think we're going to do a quick transition, and would love to pass the lead over to John. And just given COVID and the challenges, it would be ideal if we were together. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow John to go ahead and pull up the presentation. And maybe while I do that, I just wanted to let you know, please feel free to put questions into the chat, throughout the presentation and the discussion, and I will continue, to kind of aggregate the questions, and we'll have some time for that, as well as after, what I know it's going to be a really great discussion. We'll have a little bit of time to really think through in a smaller group, perhaps, in terms of what kind of resonated.
Hey, great. Can you guys hear me? Hello?
I can hear you perfect.
Okay.
Do
you see the screen shifting back and forth?
I don't see the screen just yet, but no.
Okay. For some reason, always the most entertaining part of the meeting.
It's kind of the reality these days, right? We have to accept Zoom for what it is, but yeah, something's happening, so you're on the right track. Perfect. We'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's this? Okay, wonderful.
Perfect.
That worked. Okay. The rest is easy sledding, as they say. It's great to be here with all of you this morning. Good morning. I want to begin by thanking all of you for the challenging work that you all are doing to improve life outcomes for youth. We're in the virtual Zoom world. So I'll give you a virtual hug. But thank you all for the work you're doing. So I'm guessing that if you're here, you're doing some work around systems change already, or that's certain the notion of systems change has entered your vocabulary. It's clearly an area that's much discussed these days as people around the world are seeking more effective ways to achieve population level change. The notion of how systems change happens, though, I think remains unclear to many. It continues to be a rather hazy concept. So my hope is that in the next 45, 50 minutes or so, to leave you with a clearer sense of how it is that systems change actually happens. And I want to begin with a quote from Marilyn Frye, who's a feminist writer, and she wrote about 40 years ago, and give you a sense of sort of getting into this from a poetic or a metaphorical angle. And Marilyn Frye, when she was writing about what I interpret as systems change, was really talking about sort of oppression. And in this quote I'm going to give you, she compares systemic oppression to being like a bird in a bird cage. And she says, if you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. Whoops. And I have to move my screen here because I can't read the full quote. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one, microscopically, and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage, that you can see why the bird does not go anywhere. And then you will see it in a moment. The bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be the least hindrance to its flight, but which by their relations to each other are as confining as the solid walls of a dungeon. So for me, that was just I think so many times we've sort of tried to get into these things in an analytical way. And I think thinking from the standpoint of how systems come together, it is truly helpful to think about it from the standpoint of something that's more story-like. As you engage with systems, I think, I'm guessing that you find that telling the story of what's going on is really one of the key ways to get into the notion of systems and systems change. So systems change is not new. Marginalized people and communities around the world are really the pioneers of systems change. Often, I think, more recently, international NGOs, foundations, business are talking a lot about systems change, but we remember that, within sort of marginalized communities, systems change is a concept that's really been around for decades. On top of that, we sort of see what we're seeing is a bit of an intellectualization of systems change by academia. I don't know about you, but often many of the articles I read about systems change and systems are pretty inaccessible. They're sort of opaque. They don't really sort of get at the heart of it's actually what is going on and how we can think about systems. So what we're trying to do is really demystify systems, and in the work that we're doing at the Collective Change Lab is think about how we can equip leaders to create and grow these efforts. So what is systems change? Well, you know, there are many, many definitions. I'm sure many of you have seen different definitions of systems change. The one that resonated for me came from Social Innovation Generation in Canada. And they define systems change as shifting the conditions that hold a problem in place. Shifting the conditions that hold a problem in place. That for me grounded this. It started to say, okay, I can get that. There is stuff that's going on that's keeping us around us, that's keeping us from succeeding in what we want to do. Those are the conditions. We need to shift those conditions that are holding the problem in place. Now, when we first saw this definition, we asked ourselves the question, okay, well, what are the conditions? You know, are there 60 conditions? Are there 2 conditions? And through work and research in the field, we developed a frame that really looks at what I'm going to call the 6 conditions of systems change that happen at really 3 levels of transparency, visibility, explicitness versus implicitness. And the first level is the structural level. And at this level, we're talking about policies, practices, and resource flows. I think probably these 3 areas are pretty self-evident to most everybody on this call. You know, resource flows can be, it can be money, it can be information, it can be intellectual capital. Who has access to resource flows, practices, and policies as well? This is the most explicit level, and it typically is the level at which, when we talk about the formalized systems players, as opposed to communities, the formalized players tend to think most about this level when they're talking about systems change. But there are 2 deeper levels. The second is what I call relational change, relationships and connections and power dynamics. And these are hugely powerful levers in systems change. Just to give you a really quick example, when we talk about sort of who's connected to whom, in the United States, there was some research done around sort of what drove performance in elementary schools as defined by improvement in reading and writing scores. And what the researchers found through looking at this over 10 years was that it wasn't necessarily, you know, you would think it would be better teachers, better curriculum, et cetera. The number one driver of sort of change in sort of performance was the relationships, when there were positive relationships between teachers, administrators, parents, and students, scores moved more quickly. And the researchers came away with a sort of a phrase for this of relational trust, okay? So relationships and connections may seem really squishy, but they're hugely powerful in actually changing. Systems thinking, the systems thinking field talks about the relationship, the most important unit of analysis in a system is not the part being an organization or an individual. The most important unit of analysis is not the part, it's the relationships between the parts. The relationships between the parts. If you can shift those, if you can shift that wiring, you can actually get a full shift systems to start shifting. Power dynamics, I'm guessing pretty self-explanatory to this group. But really what we're looking at is how can we transform power, right? How can we sort of have more people in the system be accountable? How can we support those who are marginalized in actually achieving more equity from the standpoint of who makes decisions and who has agency? That's power dynamics. Mental models. This is the 3rd level. We call it the transformative level of change. When we look at sort of the relational level, that's sort of semi-explicit, right? Sometimes you can see who has effective relationships and connections. Sometimes you can see where the power is, and sometimes you can't. So that's why we call it semi-explicit. Mental models are typically implicit. They are not visible from the outside. If you know, sometimes you can get a sense of what is driving somebody's behavior in terms of the mental model, but they are the most implicit of these levels. And so when we're talking about something like systemic racism, there are obviously significant policies, practices in the US, you know, resource flows in the US, things like Jim Crow laws, et cetera. But they're driven by deeper things, different sort of relationships and power dynamics and deeply seated mental models about human value and human values, right? So when we think about this, a key thing to keep in mind with, a couple of key things to keep in mind. One is if you're engaged in systems change occurs at three levels of visibility: structural, relational, and transformational. Systems change is not possible in the long term unless you pay sufficient attention to the second and third levels. And the interdependence between these conditions, these don't function in sort of isolation from each other, but a shift in a mental model will shift policies, will shift relationships, et cetera. So they're all interconnected, but it does help to sort of isolate them from the standpoint of getting a sense of specifically how do we go about developing strategies that can actually shift the system. I said earlier that often the more formalized system tends to think about this top level. That's their sense of what systems change is all about. If we think about the Affordable Care Act in the United States, which was passed by the Obama administration, it was brilliant at that top level. Less work was done around the second and third levels, and we can see what's happened with that act as it's gotten dismantled over time. So, what I want to do right now, I think this notion of the fact that you can't just work on one of these conditions, you have to really be comprehensive as you think about systems change. I'm going to run you through very briefly an example, and then we can get into breakout groups so you can hear from each other, and we all can collectively hear sort of how this is resonating with you, how this is hitting you, and what do you think are the implications for your work. But we're going to talk about same-sex marriage rights movement in the United States. I think most of you are from the United States. I think for folks in the States, this is a pretty recognizable example, but it's really interesting to look at it through the lens of thinking about the 6 conditions of systems change. If you go back to 1996, President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act into federal law. And this was a law that defined marriage for federal purposes as between the union of one man and one woman, and did not give states the ability to recognize same-sex marriages. Just 6 months, I'm sorry. So that was sort of, what happened in 1996. By 2004, there was a lurch away from that. Many people may know in 2004 that in Massachusetts, gay and lesbian couples won the right to marry. And just 6 months later, this happened. Opponents of same-sex marriage struck with voters in 11 states and approved a constitutional amendments that codified marriage as an exclusively heterosexual institution. And then in 2008, that normally coastal bastion of liberalism, California voted with Proposition 8, banning same-sex marriage and creating a new amendment of the California Constitution. So, by this time, if you were part of the Freedom to Marry movement, you were feeling pretty stuck. It was going to be really challenging to bring about systems change. Well, those that were involved in the coalition got together and said, okay, we've got to regroup. And the first thing they did was define some new goals, which they defined as 10 plus 10 plus 10 by 2020 as their vision. This was 10 states would have legal marriage, 10 would have civil unions, and 10 would have some domestic partner benefits. And then, they started to sort of implement a strategy, which they didn't have what we call the inverted triangle here up in the right-hand corner. But it's really interesting that you can actually look at what they did around each of these conditions in an interrelated way. The first was to shift their thinking, to focus their thinking on how do we shift mental models. And up until then, they had been really arguing same-sex marriage from the standpoint of, people are accorded equal rights, but they found that didn't resonate with people. But the notion that two people who are in love should have the right to marry did. And so they came up with this notion, as many people know, of love is love, to actually start to shift the mental model. They also said we need to engage people who have actually shifted their thinking. And this is a couple here, Paul and Jeanette, who initially did not support gay marriage, but had a gay child and actually shifted over in their thinking. So they created the situation and this orientation towards people being able to think about whether or not they would be permitted to actually move into a different camp and to change their mental model. From a relationships and connections standpoint, they had a lot of organizations involved, but they weren't all that well connected. And they said, okay, we're going to need to bring this together. We're going to need to create a backbone organization. We're going to need to actually become much more aligned in how we're doing the work. And each of the organizations were involved was able to sort of get a seat on the board, if you will. They said, okay, this is really a local game. So they created a database of local champions who had relationships, in community that could speak out across the country. And they also said, okay, we need to, increase, the people who are involved in this effort, and they created and recruited actively and created on-ramp for allies. They started to think about how they shifted power, and they very much said, okay, this has really got to be a grassroots movement that puts pressure on those that are in power. Maine was one example, one of their first states where they had over 100 door-to-door organizers and local champions from their communities who were speaking at events and working to build power and identify local leaders. They recognized that in their sort of self-audit of how things went in California, they said, we did not involve Black people. And in fact, as you can see from this quote, many African Americans actually voted for Proposition 8. And they said, okay, we need leaders within the Black community to become part of this effort. And there was significant outreach to sort of shift the power dynamic there. And they also said, okay, we're going to target specific legislators that weren't supportive. They were able to target and defeat 3 legislators in New York. They were able to take what had gone on in Massachusetts and fuel campaigns elsewhere. And Get Equal was a very active, direct organizer and organization that turned out people that they actively employed to shift the power dynamic. So when we start to think about resources, they secured a very large long-term donor, who had been involved, Tim Gill, in this effort to date, but really gave them a sense that he was going to be in it for the long run. They also, as you can see, sort of in the bottom statement here, look to expand the base, so to speak, by getting donors to the GOP that had gay children to back this. They got very active in the PAC arena and were able to sort of get into the mode of spank and thank various different players. And when it came to practices, they were very active in putting together these playbooks and legal briefs so that when states actually passed gay marriage, they could immediately begin issuing marriage licenses. And finally, since this story has been written, they won the national case in 2015. Gay marriage was made legal in all 50 states and greatly exceeded their initial goals. So just to wrap this up, just a couple of key lessons. Disciplined long-term strategy to move results, acting on all the conditions in the system, prioritizing relational and transformational, those second and third levels. Sometimes we talk about the second and third levels as the cultural dimensions of systems change versus that structural dimension. And again, I'll say this I think the third time I've said it, but what I see over and over and over again is particularly people, not necessarily from community, but people coming from the formalized system. When they want to address systems change, they tend to float on that top level. I'll take education reform in the United States. I've been involved in education for close to 20 years. And if you look at the reform waves come through every 4 to 5 years. And when you look at the strategies, they're 90% about sort of the structural level. And there's little attention given to the cultural level. And then we go through, 4 or 5 years, and the cultural level is just, impedes the progress people are trying to make on a structural level. People are very frustrated by that, so they come up with a new frame that tends to be more structural than cultural. Organize, don't mobilize. Build collective distributed leadership. If we were in a room together, I might have asked you at the beginning to raise your hand if you want to drive social change. And usually when I do that in a room, 80% plus people say they're there because they want to drive social change. Well, you can't drive social change. You can't drive social change. It's like trying to drive your family. We tend to think of our families are ecosystems, they're systems as well. You can't drive your family. What you can do, and what this is about, is actually addressing and working and nudging the conditions that create systems change. So keep that in mind. It's not about sort of your way. It's really about addressing the conditions for systems change to take place. Top down and bottom up. When you look at this, the triangle on the right-hand corner here. Probably the most successful systems change efforts that have occurred over the last 100 years come from movements. And where do movements start in this work? Well, they typically start, say, in the bottom left-hand corner. They work through relationships and connections and mental models to change power dynamics, to therefore change policies, practices, and resource flows. And that is the typical process through which a system can change. But it's harder for people in the formalized system, fourth time, to really think through that lens. And so I really, if you're going to do the work of systems change, I challenge you and I invite you to really think deeply about that work at the relational level and at the structural level. But it is top down as well. I mean, it does, you do need the people within the formalized system to come along. So many of you have probably heard some version of, it's top down, bottom up. It's not top down or bottom up. It's not inside out or outside. It's a bit of the both and. And then systems change is a collective act, building on-ramps to unlikely allies. Really, I think, when we get into this work, particularly at the relational and the transformational level, we're going to get a much better window into truly what's going on into the system if we engage people who have different perspectives from our own. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But to get a full sense of what's going on with, changes in the system, it's really critical to bring in those unlikely allies. So, yeah, I mean, this is intense work. It's patient work. There's a Peruvian metaphor that goes something like, the world will be changed by those with burning patience. I hope you are blessed with both, both burning and patience, because that is what the work takes. So I think, Magdalena, we're going to shift over to working groups. And do you want to introduce those? Or breakout groups, sorry.
That sounds great. No, this is great. I mean, I've certainly heard you speak before, and but every time you go through the model, and I think it's great to intentionally have an example that's not something from the international community and from the youth lens, because it pushes you to think kind of along the lines where do you see yourself? I think we see ourselves more on that structural level, and that's what I love about the dimensions of the framework, kind of pushing us more into the relational and transformation. So, but I think we wanted to maybe take 7 to 10 minutes to just get some reactions in smaller groups and some questions, just guiding questions or a way to maybe organize those discussions. Introduce yourself, and then maybe begin a conversation about what resonated with you from the framework and the presentation that John shared and outlined for us. What would you like to learn more? I know Bonnie has Bonnie Politz has put into the chat box, you know, the sort of the link to Youth Systems Collaborative, where the collaborative certainly is really interested in learning from you, and you know, how can we take the work to the next level. So I think, Alexandria, you are going to break us out into a few groups and just give us that space, and then we'll come back and then maybe do a little reflection and some Q&A to wrap us up.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I am going to send everyone out to their breakout rooms, and I'll let you know when we have a few minutes left before you have to come back to the general space for Q&A.
Awesome.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Just as a reminder, as you're coming back, please remember to mute yourself again.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're doing pretty good on time. It's certainly a really interesting discussion in our group. And I think we have a moment, you know, or two, if anyone wants to share some reflection from the discussion. And then we can also, since we have John with us and had a little bit of time to reflect on it, we could also look at some of the questions that arise from the group. So would anyone like to share in terms of what you discussed in your group, in terms of what resonated, what reflected, you know, what resonated with you in terms of the framework? Oh, Bonnie, are you speaking? You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself or no? Okay, so Alexandria, could you unmute? Maybe allow participants to unmute. Excellent.
Hi. Oh, hi. Okay, so my name is Bonnie Politz. I'm here in Washington, D.C. And Claire Gnatowski and I are sort of the co-founders of the Youth Systems Collaborative. John, I just wanted, I brought it up in the group, but just something to think about. When you brought up about the whole marriage, you know, equity, and I was saying that, you know, President Obama was not using that language yet. He was talking about civil unions, and right. He was being pushed. And one day, Joe Biden went on Meet the Press on a Sunday and said right. how he was in favor of same-sex marriage. And that pushed Obama, because the next day in a press conference he was at, and he had to start, he started using the language. But what you were describing is so much of that background work had been done, and he was able to make that shift. But it was a very interesting, you know, political process to get that kind of leadership in support of it, using that language for a system change.
Yeah, and I thank you for saying that. I do think, you know, this is one example. There are many where, you know, there's an awful lot of work that's done in the background to, you know, it's you sort of, you can't plan exactly when that moment's got to come, but when it does, you're ready. And I think that was definitely a case of that they were very intentional about sort of creating those conditions. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Otherwise, we could dive right into. Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I would, John, I really appreciated the way that you sort of presented a narrative. You know, I think that when we think about systems change, this is a historical process. And within the Youth Systems Collaborative, the 8 organizations that make up that small group, a learning network, we've been trying to sort of develop, we've been using a case study methodology, but it's, and then trying to to develop those narratives over time to explain the kind of change that's happening, and that various development projects are contributing to. It's been challenging. So, but I really love the way you presented both the narrative process as crosswalked with the framework and the different, tiles or, conditions of the framework. So any tips that you have about sort of catching the thread of that narrative, particularly in international work? It's challenging.
Yeah, Claire, thank you for raising that. I mean, first, just a deep appreciation that you're thinking from a narrative and a story standpoint. I don't think you can tell the story of systems change. You can explain systems change through sort of, annual indicators, et cetera. Yes, those are important, but those aren't going to get at the what's going on in between the 6 conditions and what's going on with the conditions. And, there's so much a focus on, the programmatic, and that misses sort of the nuance of what's going on in the context. And so I think it is very much, I really encourage you to keep trying to tell stories with data, but to try to create those threads, because that's what's needed. As far as sort of, the international, I think this is all an area for growth for all of us. I think, we're sort of catching on to the fact that we just can't, return the indicators and expect people to understand what's going on. So, I think we're sort of all in growth mode, me included, in terms of doing it. So yeah, I think I'll stop there on that.
I was going to say, I was on a call the other day, and they're talking about sort of what are the challenges and opportunities related to COVID. And people were saying, this can be an incredible opportunity to be doing and finally getting some of these more collaborative, like where they're talking about what's going on with the police systems and about how social workers need to be more brought into the frontline police work and mental health. Everybody needs to have better training in mental health, and how mental health needs to be at the core of so much of the work that we're doing in communities we haven't thought about in terms of trauma. So some of these sort of like connections and ways to reimagine the systems are that there's a potential in terms of what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think so. I think there needs to be a continued understanding of what it takes to do this work. I didn't share it today. Magdalena has seen it, but in the work we're doing at the Collective Change Lab, a lot of this work is, as you have with this coalition, trying to do the work within containers, if you will, which are collaborative structures for people to do the work together. So including the various different stakeholders. And what we're finding is that we're not going deep enough with this collaborative activity, and that we're talking about sort of radical containers that actually do go deep enough to shift systems, and they typically have 5 qualities. One is there's deep relational work done amongst those that are involved. The second is there's a focus on interchange as well as outer change. One of my favorite quotes is, the success of the intervention is based on the interior condition of the intervener. Wrap that around your mind a couple of times. So inner change as well as outer change. Third is cultivating healing. Fourth is transforming power. And fifth is welcoming in serendipity and the sacred. And I think there continues to be a fairly linear sort of industrial mode to how we do this collective change work together. And yet, it's not what's going to get us to the transformative change that we want. So that's a whole topic for another day, but yeah.
To Bonnie's point, and to John as well, and in our session, we touched a little bit, there was a question maybe from Beatrice or Julie on, is there anything that we can cite from the digital space? This conversation has me thinking, and the security space as well, which is where I work. I work in preventing and countering violent extremism, quite an amorphous field in the best of times. And it strikes me that some of what we try to do in our programs, in our work, is playing catch up. And a lot of these groups have, inadvertently or not, I think it's more intentional than we know, have already influenced and changed the systems. The fact that violent extremist organizations are recruiting over non-contiguous border using IT platforms with educated persons provided us with a kind of shock and awe that we still haven't recovered from. And we haven't had a chance to either readjust or use these same systems or alter them in order to do what we're doing in terms of mitigation. COVID-19 over the last 6 months, and it's very difficult to say COVID-19 presents opportunities. It does. And one of the areas has been, two of the areas has been, we've been compelled, I find in my work, to work across digital spaces, which means a new targeting strategy, new ways of strategic communications in my line of work, with a new set of agents and actors. And it's proving to be very interesting, very effective, and the outreach is considerable. And the second is the potential change in relations with certain elements of the security sector, particularly in a very volatile region in the MENA, Middle East and North Africa. And we've seen impressive engagements in Tunisia with the legitimization of the police force by youth engagement. And concurrently, it's been the police taking a much more human and civilian-centered approach. We've seen this in Sudan, which is going through what could be a monumental and largely nonviolent shift in its own internal state relations. And maybe the most difficult case is in Yemen, where the state is in where the state is so close to collapse that community security and community policing is the only option left, with the business sector to drive what's turning into humanitarian programming and delivery, because the humanitarian community isn't as effective as a system as the private sector is. So I think part of what I'm starting to see from this presentation, that there's a lot going on, and I just didn't have the lens, or I like the paradigm, the triangle, in which to start to view it and to understand it, and then to respond to it. And when I say respond, I mean in a way that's not reactive, that's more active or proactive. So I do believe there are examples that have been underway for a while, and a lot of those are by quite nefarious actors, or actors that we usually wouldn't engage with.
Yeah. I'm conscious of the time. I'd love to keep going for a little bit longer, but I don't know if people are going to be brought back to the main session like fairly soon. There was one question, John, in our group that came from Susan, and I think that maybe it's a good kind of a closing session as well, because you've done systems change work for quite some time, but it was about how to continue to keep the energy and enthusiasm and reinvigorate, because it is the long game, right? Any advice from you, like in terms of like how to keep that momentum going?
Yeah, I think, there are a couple of ways. One is to be really intentional about recognizing, small wins, quick wins, that happen in the short term that are in the direction of the long term, and being able to lift those up and celebrate those and get some energy from them. And that's a critical aspect. I think, bringing other people into the work can be challenging, because it's like, wow, they're not exactly on the same page as us. But it can also be, a huge infusion of additional energy, and just even, if they have different perspectives. And I think we're learning animals as a whole. And I think when we learn most of us, when we learn something new that we didn't know before, I always say about this work, if you're not surprised by the outcomes, then you're not doing the work correctly. And this really runs in the face of, sort of the evidence-based best demonstrated practices. We must know the answer before we start, but that's not what happens in complexity. So you're going to start out with some sense of where you're headed, but you're going to learn And I think if I guess the other dimension is really a focus on learning. I think we found that over and over with collective impact work is, make the meetings learning meetings. If people are learning, they'll come back. They'll become a part of it, and they'll want to come back just because they're learning, and it makes them more effective in their other work, if you will. So those would be a couple of ways. Yeah.
That's great. And I think, just to bring it, back maybe into the whole sort of youth and systems level thinking, just in terms of celebrating the initial wins, I think, Barney, Claire, Rachel, I think the youth system collaborative is a win for our community, right? The fact that we've come together and our second point, the starting point for the collaborative has really been about learning, right? So we're doing deeper dives into into what has worked for young people, when you look at that systemic level of change. So it's really really encouraging, and again, exciting to not have this session be a one-off, and we can continue to to discuss and have that collaboration and learn more from you. I think, what's left is maybe just a huge thank you to you, John, and but to all of you, kind of joining in, and Alexandria, to you, and please, convey our thanks for all of Making Sense. I know it's been a Herculean effort, so a huge thank you. I would say also, again, if you want to get connected with Bonnie and Claire and the collaborative, just let me know and I can put you in touch. And also there's quite few examples that we've explored in terms of youth systems level through the collaborative. So and then just in terms of the framework, there is a seminal paper, The Water of Systems Change. So we could also share that, as well as, should we have more time for something like that, there is a diagnostic tool that kind of allows you to see how you could apply this framework to your sort of the work of your development work, whether it's youth or other areas. So there's a lot. Like I said, hope that this is not just the start and the beginning of the journey. So yes, I know, John, do you want to say any sort of last final words?
Yeah, well, just really quickly, a question. It's related to what we were talking about, but a question came up about where do I put theory of change in all of this? And the theories of change typically break down really quickly in this complex systems change space. What I think isn't given enough attention is the theory of the problem. Theory of problem needs to come before the theory of change. And if you were to take these 6 conditions, and actually if you use the tool that we have on our website, the learning tool, you can use that to sort of try to develop a narrative theory of the problem before you get to the theory of change. Maybe a good exercise for you all to think about.
Indeed. Great. Thanks, everyone. I think this has been really, really great. Really appreciate you joining in, and looking forward to continuing the discussion. Great.
Thank you all. Take care.
You.
Have a good rest of the
Thank you, everyone.
Be safe. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.